Famine. Famine really is a very interesting one because there are actually today not an awful lot of people who starve to death. There are certainly a lot of countries in which people do not starve to death, and in fact there are a lot of countries in which some people are doing exactly the opposite and feeding themselves to death. And unfortunately I eat a little bit more than I ought to and exercise a little bit less than I should. But there's a tremendous imbalance when it comes to food. The one great thing that we have in the fight against famine is the numerous charities there are around the world, Oxfam and UNICEF and Red Cross and Red Crescent and Christian Aid and goodness knows who else, who have over the last 20, 30 years set up grain stores, set up reserves, set up places, set up a system to be able to feed people. Sad to say, there are still too many people living on a cupful of rice or maize a day, while the rest of the world throws away millions and millions of tons of good food every day. How we get that balance sorted, I don't know. And most of the famine, I'm afraid, that does occur around the world is created by man's great humanity to man. In other words, where wars and events of that nature take place, is more likely to create famine than nature does these days, because we have some protection against it. And for instance, the breadbasket of Africa, Zimbabwe, now starves more of its people than anywhere else starves of its own people within its own territory. And that's purely and simply through the management and the political powers that are in there. Health. Well, health's on the go again at the moment, isn't it really? We're all thinking about the whole problem of, are we all going to get swine flu within the next 24 hours, and we're going to have 100,000 a day catching swine flu in the...
MMS. Get some MMS.
Get some MMS. That's it. Maybe get a bit of swine flu, actually. It's an antidote in itself, really. And it's just unfortunate that it will attack vulnerable people, and it's always vulnerable people that get attacked. It doesn't matter what's attacking them. It's always the vulnerable that suffer as a result of any of these things. But health, fortunately, through the World Health Organization and through many other organizations, health in general is generally looked after well around the world. Again, it is out of balance, it's out of kilter, because in the Western world we've got as much health care as we may naturally need, whereas in a lot of places there is too little health care. But in general terms, when epidemics, pandemics or other demics turn up, we have organisations around the world who can handle these things. Education is the other one that's now greyed on that list, and you may wonder why education is in there in the first place. What has education got to do with the world problem? Well, it's simply this, really. To know all is to understand all, or to understand all is to know all. And I think if we had better education around the world and better understanding around the world, then one heck of a lot of the things that have appeared on my lists of problems so far would never even appear on those lists. They would be far diminished from that which they are. But then we come to the one at the bottom. Good old housing. And housing is an unusual problem, because generally speaking, most people would not even put it on there as a global issue. Most people don't even think about it as a global issue. Most people think about all the other items on there rather than housing. When you say homelessness instead, though, then people think of something different. And suddenly homelessness becomes a close. It's a few beggars in the streets, it's a few people sleeping rough here and there. But you know, there's a funny thing about homelessness. There is nobody starving to death in this country other than somebody who wants to. It's either on hunger strike or through illness or sickness or whatever. But there is nobody in this country starving. There are lots of other countries in which people are not starving. This country has a very good health situation. This country has a half reasonable education system. It could be better, but it's half reasonable. This country understands peak production and is not overproducing now in certain areas like coal, for instance, etc., and is hanging on to reserves to a certain extent, and to oils and to natural gases and to other things, though the government are not telling that. And this country knows an awful lot about climate change. But what do you know about homelessness? What does anybody know about homelessness?
400,000.
500,000 people in this country are homeless. 500,000 people in this country are homeless.
What is your definition of homeless?
Somebody without a home to live in on a regular basis, who is either having to live with somebody else, share, live in a home that is not their own home, living in accommodation, shelter or whatever else. Rough sleepers, maybe 4,000 or 5,000. But they're not homeless. And a lot of those people are actually there by choice. The homeless people are the people who can't live in their own homes, who are in hostels, goodness knows what other arrangements which are not suitable to them. And that's the problem of homelessness, because homelessness, to a certain extent, is covered up. When you look at homelessness worldwide, you have any idea what the figure is? Well, again, it's one of these figures that nobody really produces because nobody actually ties it down. But it's estimated to be round about 500 million people. 500 million people worldwide are homeless for one reason and or another. That is about 8% of the world's population are homeless. It is quite a staggering thing. And it's often caused by a variety of things, some of which are not necessarily that obvious. Because, do you know, there are people still in this country who are technically speaking homeless because of the floods that happened around Hull 2 years ago. They are not living in their own homes yet because they're still to be finished off and sorted and got back. 2 years ago. So there are people who are homelessness through no fault of their own, and that occurs all around the world. Now, the charity that I am involved in, Nest, provides funding and the knowledge to build earth homes in areas of need. And I'll come back onto these a little bit for you. An earth home is an ecological solution to one of the world's greatest problems, as we've already said, and that is homelessness. Every year, more than 35 million people have to abandon their homes around the world for one reason or another. Maybe a tsunami, maybe an earthquake, maybe a war here or a war there. And those are some of the major causes: war, crime, political unrest, and natural disaster. In other words, there's a fallout into homelessness from virtually everything that goes on in the world